When Adam Lanza did what he did, especially involving children, it just strikes me that there's a component of his, I guess I'd say his humanity that had been switched off. Almost like he became non-human or subhuman or inhuman at a minimum. And a parallel that the gentleman on the left had mentioned earlier, paralleled in very brief fashion his actions with those of Hitler. And perhaps there'd be a similar parallel with Mr. Kaczynski's brother. My question is, why does that happen? What causes humans to switch it off? I don't know that you'll have an answer, but it's been on my mind.
Thank you for your question, which is an excellent one. I don't know that I have the answer. When I hear your question, I want to think, psychiatrically and research-wise, and the things that we know about, the biological causes of violence and things. And the truth of the matter is that the causes of violence are very complex, and we understand it relatively poorly at this time. But when I've thought long and hard about this, the research shows us, at least at this point, that if you look at all the violence in society, a sliver of it, 3 to 5%, can be attributed to what we call serious mental illness in psychiatry. And most of that is directed at individuals in the person's own family. So it's very rare. So this brings up a question of where to focus on in terms of violence prevention. But I think the other thing that I've found in my career is that I see so many people who suffer from serious mental illness, and they could never do something like this in their entire lives, no matter what happened. And so then it occurs to me that people can do things like this if they have mental illness, or they can do things like this if they have liver disease. And then this brings me to the conclusion that in cases like this where I've studied various persons who have done what this individual did, I studied one in Binghamton, New York, that was somewhat similar. What I see is an intense anger that must be directed outwards, and that becomes blinding, and the focus is on the self and that anger to the exclusion of other things. Because the question comes up, how can people do this to another person? And I think it's a focus on the anger that overtakes the ability to make that connection. And I think, I could wax scientific, but I'm hoping that kind of generalistic part answers your question. And maybe someone else has some. Yeah.
When something like what happened here happens, people all over the world question, how could any human being do this? And, for the community, that is a more intense question. How could one of us do this? And, when somebody like my brother does this from our family, the question becomes extraordinarily, existentially intense. How could my own brother do this? Someone I love, someone I felt close to, someone who I know is capable of compassion. I don't know the whole answer. Certainly, I don't begin. I have some thoughts about it, and one is it's connected to hatred. It's like hatred in self and hatred of other really do go together. And so my biggest fear for many years, actually, after a friend's brother committed suicide, was that Ted seemed so miserable. I was afraid someday I'd hear that he'd committed suicide. And I think that was likely. In his diaries, he actually had some sort of scenario that involved murder-suicide. I think some of his aggression toward our family, our parents, which I really couldn't understand, was emotionally violent. In some sense, metaphorically, it was killing Mom and Dad, but it had some of that flavor. I also think we're not being honest with ourselves if we don't look at human history and say there's something somewhat normal about violence in human beings. Like, how does this happen? I mean, we have murders, we have genocides, we have wars. I remember my father telling a story from his father, who had been born in Poland and pressed into the Polish army, and he said, well, we went to fight this battle, and I don't know what happened, but we started killing everybody in the town, and then men started raping women, and these were like normal family men. How did this happen? We know that part of the training of soldiers is to desensitize to the humanity of the enemy. So it's true we can be trained for compassion. We can be trained to shut down compassion. So I think the highest teachings of all religious traditions is to try to create an antidote to this nihilistic possibility that probably lives to some extent in all of us, to smaller or greater degrees. When I ultimately ended up reading my brother's diaries, it was like opening a window on hell. Like, I had no idea he was suffering to this extent. So part of his dynamic, and maybe with other mass murderers, there's this incredible, intense psychological isolation. So then I think, well, if only Ted had a friend, a mentor, and then of course I realized many people could have been, but he pushed them away. But how do you reach that person that's really, really hard to reach? Certainly we see some correlation, like with bullying in the schools. So the kid is isolated, the kid feels absolutely powerless. This is not to excuse violent acting out, but it strikes me we have to really, I actually agree with Dr. Knoll, but I also think it's creating a different kind of communal consciousness as well. It's not just our individual minds, it's the candle, lighting the candle 1,000 times, that somehow we have to make this idea of compassion, we have to find a way to spread it, and not give up, and not fail to spread it with people who seem resistant to it, and we can't blame them for their resistance. It's like, I don't know, but I do believe that communities can actually have a collective kind of consciousness, and I have to say I'm incredibly impressed by what I've seen and read about this community in terms of your commitment, your devotion to say the victims will be remembered and positive change is going to come out of this tragedy. I think it's possible. That's what keeps me going. It's also why I practice Buddhism.
I'd just like to add to what's been said already. And I'm no expert in terms of psychiatry, just from what I've heard and the teachings that I've received. But when we experience pain, as it has been brought up, it's in our own mind. It's not what we experience. It is our thoughts about what we experience that is where the pain lies. And people can just keep focusing on themselves and their own pain. And they don't see that there are other people that are suffering like them. And it's just turning inward and more inward. And the more inward you turn, the more you see that you're not getting what you want. And that people are continually, from your point of view, keeping you from getting what you want. And the pain just gets more and more intense. And if you think about it, even a pet dog that is the kindest, most wonderful, gentle dog, if it gets hit by a car and is still alive but seriously injured, you have to put something over its muzzle to keep it from biting you if you wanted to comfort it. You know, because its pain is so great, it could bite. Another example is in Buddhism, we talk about grounding in the ocean of suffering. And a grounding person will ground a rescuer. They're in such a state of panic that if you would swim out to them to try to rescue them, if they could grab a hold of you before you grab a hold of them, they'll be on top of you and stay on top of you until you're drowned. And I see these people as being in an incredibly strong state of panic and pain. You know, I can't say, well, this person is and that person isn't, but that's kind of the Buddhist approach to all of this.
I want to say something, just one more thing really quickly, and then I'll be quiet. But I want to just talk a little bit about what would I say, the way, contagiousness of compassion. My wife and I have quite a connection with the state of Connecticut. We actually have an apartment that we keep in Bloomfield in case they fire us at the monastery. But it goes back before that. Shortly after my brother's trial, I received a phone call from a man in Connecticut who's actually sitting right here. His name is Dr. Sam Rieger. And Sam Rieger and his wife Wanda invited me to a conference called the Melanie Eileen Rieger Conference Against Violence. And I have gone, 14 or 15 years in a row now. I'll be going again this year. And these are folks, and all the folks that work with them are people who've lost loved ones to homicide, who have made a decision. Think of the title, A Conference Against Violence. And it was there I really began first to build a bridge really to the sense that, you know, victims' families and offenders' families have a lot in common in certain ways, and we have a common cause to prevent violence and to work on healing.